HR told me I was suspended because I'd approved a decision that cost someone their job. They said my digital signature was on the authorization. They said I'd reviewed the complaint, read the evidence, and signed off. I told them I'd never seen the file. They slid a printout across the table with my name on it anyway. Here's how it happened. Started months earlier with a role I didn't even want. Our team was understaffed, deadlines were slipping, and management needed someone to act as a backup reviewer. Basically a name that could approve things when the primary manager was unavailable. They framed it as procedural, temporary, administrative, just a safety net, they said. No real authority, no real decisions, just a box to check. I said yes because it sounded harmless and because saying no felt like making a problem where there wasn't one. First, nothing happened. No approvals, no emails, no alerts. My name just sat there in some internal system I never logged into. Then one morning I was called into HR. They didn't ask me how I was. They didn't sit down casually. They didn't smile. They told me an internal investigation had concluded. They told me disciplinary action had already been taken. They told me the approval came from me. They showed me the file, a misconduct report, interview summaries, a final recommendation. At the bottom, my digital signature, time-stamped, verified, logged. I said it wasn't mine. They said the system doesn't make mistakes. They said my credentials were used. They asked if I'd shared my login. I said no. They asked if I'd approved anything without reading. I said no. They asked if I was under pressure from anyone. I said no. Every answer made me sound more defensive, more guilty. Then they told me who had been fired. And that's when everything shifted, because it wasn't someone powerful. It wasn't a manager. It wasn't someone with influence. It was someone quiet, low level, easy to remove. Someone who had recently filed a complaint of their own. And suddenly, my name wasn't just on a form. It was on a narrative. A story that made the company look clean and decisive. A story where I wasn't just involved, I was useful. They put me on paid suspension pending review, which is corporate language for we're deciding how much blame to assign you. I wasn't allowed to access my work email. My badge stopped working. Even the internal messaging apps logged me out automatically. It was like being erased in real time. I asked for the audit logs. HR said they'd get back to me. Days passed. Then I started hearing things. From coworkers who were suddenly nervous talking to me. From people who'd been careful with their words before and now avoided me entirely. The fired employee had accused a senior manager of misconduct. The investigation into that complaint had been inconclusive. The investigation into the fired employee's behavior, however, had moved fast. Too fast. I finally received the logs. They showed my credentials accessing the system late at night, reviewing documents, clicking approval fields, on days I was asleep, on days I was traveling, on days I could prove I wasn't online. I pointed this out. IT said the logins came from an internal IP range, meaning someone inside the company, meaning it wasn't a hacker. It was someone with access, someone who knew exactly how the system worked, someone who knew my role. I asked who else had permission to approve decisions. They told me only primary reviewers and designated backups. There were 3 backups, me included, but only my name appeared on the final authorization. I asked how that was possible. They said the system prioritizes the most neutral reviewer if multiple approvals are available. Neutral. I hated that word. It meant I wasn't vocal. I wasn't political. I wasn't known for pushing back. I was safe. As the days went on, the pressure changed shape. HR stopped asking if I'd done it and started asking if I meant to, if I'd been influenced, if I'd been careless. They suggested maybe I'd approved it quickly, without reading, and just didn't remember. That suggestion was worse than an accusation, because memory is slippery, and the more they repeated it, the more I started doubting myself. Then the fired employee reached out. Not angrily, not accusing. Just one message. I know you didn't do this, but they're using you. That message terrified me, because it meant they'd seen the same pattern I was only starting to understand. Someone had needed a clean name, a compliant name, a name without enemies. They didn't need authority. They needed plausibility, and I fit perfectly. When HR finally called me back in, it wasn't to clear me. It was to offer a path forward. I could accept responsibility for a procedural oversight. I could keep my job. I could sign a document acknowledging unintentional approval. The case would be closed. The fired employee would stay fired, and the company would move on. All they needed was my signature. Again, I asked what would happen if I refused. The HR manager paused, then said, "That would complicate things." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about what happened. It was about whether I was willing to be the ending they'd already written. I didn't sign it. Not that day. I asked for time, which HR pretended was reasonable while clearly not liking it. They reminded me, politely, that refusing the agreement could expose me to risk. That word again, risk, never clearly defined, always heavy enough to scare people into compliance. I went home and opened my laptop, even though I technically wasn't supposed to. I couldn't access company systems, but I still had old files, old emails, things I'd never bothered deleting. That's when I noticed something. Months earlier, an email thread about backup reviewers had gone out. Buried in it was a single line I'd skimmed past at the time. Backup approvals may be auto-routed during primary reviewer conflicts. Auto-routed, meaning if the system decided someone else couldn't approve fast enough, it would choose a backup and move forward. Not ask, just assign. I dug deeper. The senior manager accused in the original complaint had admin-level access. Not to approvals directly, but to workflow settings, routing rules, time thresholds. They couldn't sign my name, but they could make sure the system did. I brought this to HR. They didn't look surprised. That's what broke me. They said the system was technically compliant. They said intent was hard to prove. They said escalating this could damage multiple careers, including mine. I asked them a simple question. Why was my name the only one used? No one answered directly. They talked around it. About optics, about trust, about how I was widely respected. That was the moment I understood the real reason. I wasn't chosen because I was careless. I was chosen because I was believable. I refused to sign. 2 weeks later, I was terminated, officially for failure to cooperate with an internal resolution. The senior manager stayed. The fired employee never got their job back. And in the final internal report, my name appears once, under a section labeled Process Breakdown. No villain, no hero, just a malfunction. Sometimes I wonder if I should have signed. If keeping my job would have been the smarter move. If refusing really changed anything beyond my own life. But then I think about how easy it would have been to say yes again. How clean the ending would have looked. And how someone else would have paid for it. If this story made you uncomfortable, good. That means you're paying attention. Subscribe before you go, because the most dangerous stories aren't about bad people. They're about systems that know exactly who to use. The police officer kept pointing at my front door like it wasn't mine anymore. He asked why my address was listed in a felony report when I told him I hadn't been home all weekend. Then he asked who I let stay there. The way he said "let" made it clear this wasn't a casual question. Something bad had happened inside my apartment, and on paper it traced back to me. Here's how it happened. It started as a favor that felt too small to matter. I had plans to be out of town for a few days, and a friend of a friend reached out in a group chat asking if anyone knew a place they could crash. They were in town sorting things out. Just needed somewhere temporary. Promised they'd barely be there. I hesitated, but not for long. They weren't a stranger exactly. We'd met once or twice at gatherings. Quiet, polite, always on their phone, but in a way that felt anxious, not sketchy. Everyone vouched for them in that vague way people do. They're fine, they're chill, they won't cause trouble. I told them they could stay for the weekend. I didn't charge them, didn't draw up anything formal. Just handed over my spare key and sent a long text with house rules I didn't think I'd need to enforce. No parties, no guests, no drama. They replied with a thumbs up emoji and a thanks again. Seriously. I left town that night. The weekend passed quietly. No texts, no missed calls. I assumed everything was fine. When I came back Sunday evening, the apartment looked normal. Too normal. Bed untouched, dishes clean, trash taken out. It almost felt like no one had been there at all. I remember thinking how considerate they were. Monday morning, 2 officers knocked on my door. They asked if I lived alone, if I'd been home over the weekend, if I recognized a name I'd never heard before. Then they told me my address had come up during an investigation. Not because something had happened to my apartment, but because something had started there. I laughed at first. I actually laughed because it sounded absurd. They didn't. They asked again who had access to my place. I told them about the weekend guest. Explained it was temporary, casual, harmless. One of the officers wrote the name down slowly, then looked at the other and nodded. That nod was the moment my stomach dropped. They asked if I'd given them permission to use my address for anything. Mail, deliveries, online accounts. I said no. They told me multiple packages had been sent to my apartment that weekend. Picked up, signed for, all under different names, but all traced back to activity now being investigated as fraud. And because the address was mine, I was now part of the timeline. I told them I had proof I wasn't there. Travel receipts, messages, location data. They said that would help. But then one of them added something I wasn't ready for. The person who stayed here told us you knew exactly what was going on. I felt my throat go dry, because whatever they'd done, whatever was now unfolding, it was already clear they hadn't just borrowed my apartment. They'd borrowed my credibility, and I had no idea how much of it they'd spent before they left. They didn't arrest me that morning. That almost made it worse. Instead, they asked if I could come down to the station to clear a few things up. They said it casually, like it was optional, like I had a choice. But one of them was already stepping back from my door, giving me that look people give when they've decided you're coming whether you want to or not. At the station, everything slowed down. They separated facts from assumptions in a way that felt deliberate, painful, like they were peeling layers off something I didn't even realize I was wrapped in. They asked me to walk through the weekend minute by minute. When I left, how I traveled, who knew I'd be gone, how long the guest had access to the apartment, whether I'd checked in on them. I answered everything honestly. Too honestly, probably. I offered details they didn't ask for, hoping transparency would make me look innocent instead of nervous. It didn't help. They showed me photos next. Packages stacked neatly by my door. My door. Labels with my address. Different names. Different senders. Different companies. All ordered within a 36-hour window. Then surveillance footage from the building lobby. The guest coming and going. Calm. Unhurried. Hood up, head down. Signing for deliveries with practiced ease. Sometimes twice in the same hour. One clip showed them pausing outside my door, checking their phone, then looking directly up at the hallway camera before stepping inside. The officer paused the video right there. "Do you recognize that look?" he asked. I shook my head. He leaned back and said, "That's someone who knows they won't be questioned." That sentence stayed with me. They told me the packages were tied to a broader fraud case. Stolen cards, fake identities, online resales. Nothing violent, but nothing small either. Enough money involved to make everyone nervous. They asked if I'd ever shared my ID, if I'd ever let anyone use my address for verification, if I'd ever received mail that wasn't mine before. I said no to all of it. That's when they told me something that didn't make sense. My name had been used to confirm residency. not just the address. Me. Someone had answered security questions correctly. Someone had provided details about my lease, my building, even my schedule. Enough to pass automated checks. They didn't say it outright, but the implication hung there. Whoever stayed in my apartment didn't just use the space. They studied me. I remembered the questions they'd asked when we met. Where I worked. How long I'd lived there. Whether the building had cameras. Whether packages ever got stolen. At the time, it felt like small talk. Now it felt like reconnaissance. I told the officers everything I remembered. Every text. Every interaction. Every detail that suddenly felt incriminating in hindsight. They took my phone. They said it was temporary. That word didn't comfort me. Before I left, one of the officers said something that made my chest tighten. We're still determining whether you were careless or complicit. I walked out of the station without my phone, without certainty, and without the version of myself who believed favors stayed small. That night, alone in my apartment, I noticed things I'd missed before. A scuff near the outlet, like something had been unplugged and plugged back in repeatedly. A router log showing devices I didn't recognize. A faint indentation on the kitchen counter where boxes had sat longer than I realized. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. And I wasn't just a bystander in it. I was infrastructure. I lay awake wondering how convincing my innocence really sounded when the facts were laid out coldly. How easily, I didn't know, could start to sound like, I didn't ask. And the worst part, the person who stayed in my apartment hadn't vanished. They were still active, still using addresses, just not mine anymore, which meant eventually they'd circle back. And when they did, I had no idea whether I'd be a witness or the reason the whole thing collapsed. They came back 3 weeks later, not in uniform this time. 2 plainclothes officers stood outside my door like they belonged there, like this apartment was already halfway theirs. One of them held a folder. The other already knew my name without asking. They told me they'd found the person who stayed in my place. Correction, they'd found one of them, because it turned out there was a pattern. My apartment wasn't the first address used. It wasn't the last either, just the cleanest, the easiest, the one that raised the fewest flags because I raised none. They explained it slowly, like they were gauging how much I could handle. The guest had been cycling through short-term stays, borrowed rooms, weekend sublets, couch favors, each place used just long enough to receive packages, set up accounts, establish legitimacy, then abandoned before suspicion could settle. What made my place different was me. Stable job, clean record, no prior investigations, a building with cameras that made everything look official instead of shady. I wasn't random. I was selected. They showed me a transcript of messages recovered from the suspect's phone. My name was in it, not casually, strategically. Address is solid. Tenants predictable. Out of town confirmed. Won't question it. Reading those lines felt worse than being accused, because they weren't wrong. I'd been predictable. Then came the part one wasn't prepared for. The officer told me some of the fraud tied to my address had already gone through. Money moved. Accounts closed. Evidence blurred. My cooperation had helped, but it hadn't erased everything. Legally, I wasn't being charged, but I also wasn't clear. My name would stay in the file as an unwitting facilitator, a footnote in a larger case, something that could be explained, but never fully erased. Before they left, one officer said, almost kindly, "You did the right thing coming forward." I wanted to ask when. When exactly had I done the right thing? When I said yes. When I left town. When I opened the door to strangers because it felt easier than saying no. That night, I packed up the spare key and threw it away. I changed passwords, updated locks, set delivery restrictions I never thought I'd need. And still, every time a package shows up at my door now, my stomach tightens. Because I learned something no one warns you about. Crimes don't always start with bad intentions. Sometimes they start with politeness, with trust, with a favor that feels too small to matter. I don't know where that person is now. I don't know how many other doors they knocked on. But I do know this: the worst part wasn't being investigated. It was realizing how easy I'd made it. If someone asked you for a harmless favor like that, would you say yes? Or would you pause long enough to wonder why they chose you? If the story made you rethink your own boundaries, make sure you subscribe before you leave. These stories don't end when the video does. They follow you into the next choice you make. I heard my name right after the verdict was announced. The courtroom was already reacting. Whispers, chairs scraping, someone crying. But all I could hear was the judge reading my name as if I'd been part of the case all along. The defendant turned around, nodded at me once, and smiled. That smile made it very clear. Whatever just happened, I had helped make it happen. And I still didn't know what the charges even were. Here's how it happened. Years earlier, I said yes to something so small I forgot about it almost immediately. It was after work, during a casual conversation with someone I barely knew outside of a shared professional setting. We weren't friends. We weren't close. We just existed in the same orbit for a short period of time. They were polite, soft-spoken, always careful with their words. The kind of person you don't remember clearly but also never distrust. At some point, they asked if they could list me as a reference. Not a strong one. Not someone who would be called. Just a name that showed they weren't completely on their own. I hesitated for a second, asked what it was for. They said future opportunities, and smiled in a way that felt harmless. I told myself it didn't matter, that nothing serious could come from it, that people did this all the time. I said yes. They thanked me like I'd done them a favor that mattered more than I realized. Then life moved on. Different job, different apartment, different routine. That person disappeared from my world entirely. I never got a call, never got an email, no follow-up. Nothing that reminded me my name was attached to theirs in any way. Until the courthouse. I wasn't there for them. I was there for something else entirely, jury duty, ironically. Sitting in the back, half listening, waiting for my number to be called so I could go home. Then the judge started summarizing character considerations. And then my name came up. Not once, twice. Quoted, attributed, framed as evidence of reliability and trust. I stood up instinctively, said there must be a mistake, that I'd never submitted anything, that no one had contacted me. The judge looked at me, unimpressed, and said my statement had been submitted digitally, verified, and reviewed. I said it wasn't mine. The clerk said it was signed. The defendant turned around and smiled again. Slower this time, like they knew something I didn't. That's when the judge asked me if I wanted to clarify my position on the record. And suddenly I realized the worst part. Whatever I said next wouldn't just correct an error. It would actively change the outcome of a case already in motion. I finally asked what the case was about. The room went quiet, and when I heard the charge, my chest tightened in a way I still can't fully describe. Because it wasn't minor. It wasn't harmless. And my name, my forgotten casual yes, was being used as proof that this person deserved the benefit of the doubt. I had walked into that courtroom thinking I was invisible, but somehow, without knowing it, I'd been part of the story the entire time. They gave me a short recess to collect my thoughts, which was a polite way of saying decide how much damage you're willing to do. I stepped out into the hallway, heart pounding, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with that person. There weren't many. That was the problem. There wasn't enough memory to lean on, just fragments. Polite conversations, small talk, that one moment where they asked to list me as a reference and I said yes without asking why. A court officer approached me and explained carefully that my clarification could go two very different ways. If I formally denied the statement, the defense would likely argue that the submission was a compilation of my prior feedback and publicly available records, not a forgery. In other words, my denial wouldn't erase the content. It would just shift responsibility in an unclear direction. If I didn't deny it outright, if I said something neutral, something vague, the statement would stand as contextual evidence of character. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't have to. The prosecutor joined us next. He was blunt. He said the case was delicate, that intent was difficult to prove, that character references like mine often tipped the scale. He asked me directly if I believed the defendant was capable of the charges. I said I didn't know them well enough to say. He nodded, but I could tell that wasn't the answer he wanted. Then the defense attorney appeared. She thanked me. That alone made my stomach drop. She spoke about growth, about how people deserve not to be defined by their worst moments, about how my past comments, things I barely remembered writing, showed that I saw something good in her client once. She never asked me to lie. She didn't need to. She just asked me to confirm that at one point in time I didn't see them as a bad person. And the uncomfortable truth was, I hadn't. When we went back into the courtroom, the judge asked me to take the stand. Under oath, everything felt heavier. They walked me through my history with the defendant. Every answer I gave was technically honest. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I didn't defend. But I also didn't dismantle the narrative that had been built using my name. When the defense read parts of the statement aloud, I interrupted to say I hadn't written it in that form. The judge asked, "But do these statements accurately reflect your opinion at the time?" That question hit harder than anything else. At the time, I paused too long. Long enough for the silence to say what my mouth didn't. I said carefully that my opinion had been limited and context-specific. The defense smiled slightly. The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled. The statement stayed in evidence. As I stepped down from the stand, I realized something deeply unsettling. No one needed me to lie. They just needed me not to fight hard enough. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the defendant knew that from the beginning. They hadn't chosen me because I was important. They'd chosen me because I was safe, because I wouldn't make a scene, because I'd hesitate, because I'd already said yes once. When the closing arguments began, I sat there listening to my own words I'd written years ago for an entirely different purpose, being used to argue that someone deserved leniency. And I still didn't know if they deserved it. That uncertainty felt worse than guilt, because when the verdict came, there would be no clear line between what I'd done and what I'd allowed. The verdict didn't come immediately. The jury took hours, and every minute felt like borrowed time I didn't deserve. I kept replaying the moment I said yes years ago, wondering how something that casual could stretch this far into the future and wrap itself around a courtroom full of strangers. When the jury finally came back, the room shifted. You can feel it when something irreversible is about to happen. Papers stop rustling. People stop breathing normally. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. On the primary charge, they said, "We find the defendant not guilty." There was a sharp inhale somewhere behind me. The defendant closed their eyes for a second, then exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for years. The judge continued reading, technicalities, explanations, legal phrasing, but it all blurred. What cut through the noise was one sentence spoken almost casually. The court notes the character context provided by multiple sources, plural, not just me, but my name had been the strongest one. I knew that without being told. The defendant turned around as they were uncuffed, not smiling this time, just calm, grounded, like this outcome had always been within reach. They caught my eye and nodded, not grateful, not apologetic, acknowledging, as if we'd both played our parts. Outside the courthouse, people gathered, friends, reporters, family members I didn't recognize. Someone brushed past me and said, "Thank you for standing up for them." I didn't correct them. I didn't know how, because what would I even say? I didn't mean to. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to make things worse. None of that sounded like innocence. Weeks later, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. No subject line, Just one sentence in the body. I knew you'd be fair. That was it.
No signature. No explanation.
I stared at that sentence longer than I want to admit, because I wasn't fair. I was careful, and there's a difference. I didn't lie under oath. I didn't fabricate evidence. But I also didn't tear down a version of me that someone else had built for their own survival. The case faded from public memory quickly. It always does. New stories replace old ones. Outrage has a short shelf life, but it didn't fade for me. Every time someone asks me for a reference now, I freeze. Every time I hear about character statements or vouching for someone, my stomach tightens, because I learned something the hard way. You don't have to actively help someone do harm to be part of the reason they walk away from it. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet yes, and the courage you didn't use later. If you were in my place, would you have spoken up louder and risked ruining someone's life? Or stayed careful and lived with never knowing if you did the right thing? If stories like this keep you thinking long after the video ends, make sure you subscribe. These aren't just stories to listen to, they're choices you'll eventually be asked to make too.